Hey guys, I'm Dov, and today I'm back with a bit of a different video. Yes, indeed. Today I'm going to be doing the first of what I hope to be many top list videos. So today we're going to be looking at lores of Magic. I'm going to be going through my top 5 common lores of Magic, at least as of the current moment in the current meta. I'm recording this in the Queen and the Crone patch, I guess you could say. It's actually the Charybdis update. I forget what the actual name of the update is, but it's the Charybdis update essentially. But a lot of this I'm sure will be applicable largely going forward, but you know, things could change here and there, and lores of Magic do fluctuate quite a bit sometimes, so you know, keep that in mind. If you're watching this at a later date, this was recorded at that time. I will also say one more caveat, which is that this is my top 5 list, and I'm sure that many of you will disagree with me, which I welcome and embrace, and I encourage you to put your disagreement in the comments down below. What are your top 5 common lores of Magic? For me, we're going to get started here, and the runner-up didn't quite make the top 5, but it was really close, so I had to mention it, is Lore of Metal here. You can see Barfazar using his Staff of Volens to do some fancy magic. We'll watch some of the different spell animations play out as I'm kind of talking here, but Lore of Metal in general has some really good utility spells. Not all the spells are amazing. Glimmering Robe can be okay in certain situations. It's a little niche, and Gehenna's Hounds isn't the best Vortex, although it is certainly decent. But Plague of Rust is one of the best cheap debuffs in the game. Very cheap for an armor debuff. Searing Doom, of course, does great armor, non-armor piercing damage, very good against lightly armored units. A very nice tight area of effect, and of course all these spells proc the metal shifting, which is one of the better lore attributes in the game right now, in my opinion, with 10% map-wide weapon damage and armor piercing damage. Of course, Final Transmutation is a massive single target, not single target, area of effect, but it scales well against single entity models. Big old area of effect damage spell. And of course, Transmutation of Lead is a nasty big debuff. 26 melee attack, 25% weapon damage. So anyway, that's the runner-up. Let's go to now number 5, which is going to be Lore of Heavens. Yes, indeed. Lore of Heavens, one of the best lores of Magic in the game. Its lore attribute is a little bit niche. It's one that I more often than not cut, but the spells themselves are really where the Lore of Heavens shines. Harmonic Convergence is basically the mirror of a spell we're going to be looking at in just a moment, Enfeebling Foe, but useful in almost any situation whenever you need to win a specific engagement. Plus 26 melee attack, 27 melee defense, especially in a game that favors combat stats much more so than Total War Warhammer 1. Melee attack and defense are much more important due to the changes in the values. I'll have a link down in the description below to my How to Read Stat Card video if you have any questions about that. But anyway, Harmonic Convergence, great. Wind Blast, very cost effective. Wind spell does great damage to low armor units, and if you overcast, it does even decent damage to armored units. Uranus Thunderbolt, a nice tight area of effect bombardment, single big explosion, and it does some decent armor piercing damage. Curse of the Midnight Wind, one of the best debuffs in the game, a huge area of effect, and pulls away armor and melee attack, which in a multitude of situations can be very useful, can make non-armor piercing troops shine against armored opponents, which is always useful. Comet of Cassandora is a big old bombardment, does a ton of damage. It's not that expensive, it's reasonably expensive, but yeah, it does a lot of damage. I typically don't take this just because it does have a relatively long spin-up time and is a little bit easy to dodge, but if you connect, it's certainly devastating. And then Chain Lightning, one of the better Vortex spells in the game, in my opinion. You can't overcast it, but just the regular version, it's not wildly expensive, and it does a lot of damage. So I definitely like Lore of Heavens quite a bit, and it is my number 5. Moving on to number 4, we're going to go to one of the quote-unquote toolkit lores, in my opinion, which is Lore of Fire. Yes, indeed. Lore of Fire is the specialist anti-regeneration lore. So in tabletop, fire damage would actually negate regeneration, like it would interrupt regeneration, but in Total War Warhammer, it just applies a plus 25% damage bonus to units that have regeneration. There are other units that are weak to fire as well, Tomb King's characters, you know, the Tree Spirit units, other various units as well. So basically, Lore of Fire is if you want to take out something that has regeneration or is otherwise weak to fire, you bring Lore of Fire, which means against someone like the Vampire Counts, Norska, there are a handful of other matchups where you may want to deal with some regenerating units. Lore of Fire is very useful. Let's take a look at the spells here. Cascading Fire Cloak, a very nice, cheap, single target debuff. 27 melee defense, which is excellent, and 20% armor piercing damage. Great to use in a elite fight with, you know, heroes fighting heroes, or big expensive unit fighting another big expensive unit. Very useful in that aspect. Fireball's a nice, relatively cheap magic missile, does some pretty decent damage, especially, again, if the opponent is weak to fire. Flaming Sword of Ruin is going to be your main bread and butter here. It gives magic and fire damage into, I believe it's both missile and melee attacks. I know at least the fire damage goes to both. I don't know if the magic damage goes to both. I assume it does, but both magic and fire damage in melee and with their missiles as well, and it also gives 25% weapon and missile damage, so a nice buff spell there. A Burning Head is a great wind spell, relatively slow moving. It doesn't do the most damage, but it does a really good amount of damage to low armor units. If you overcast it, it's even pretty decent against armor, and it applies that -8 leadership from the burnt effect, which is probably the most important part. Very, very good at clearing out chaff lines because it does some damage to the low armor and then applies that leadership debuff. Really good against factions like Skaven, you know, other like factions. Let's see. Piercing Bolts of Burning, one of the strongest bombardment spells in the game. This thing does a ton of damage right now, like just a ludicrous amount of armor piercing damage. Nice tight area of effect, very good to use against pretty much any elite unit, and I've even seen it used against some of the bigger monsters in the game that have a big hitbox, and if all the missiles that are coming down connect, it'll do a lot of damage to them. Even something like, you know, like a Hell Pit Abomination, or even like a Star Dragon, because it has a big hitbox, pretty much all the missiles will connect, and it'll do a lot of damage. Flamestorm is a devastating vortex, especially if you overcast it. If you overcast it, it's probably one of the longest lasting vortexes in the game. This thing will just hang around for a long time. Relatively expensive and risky as vortexes usually are, but has most of the upsides of vortexes. Definitely one of the more powerful ones. So that's Lore of Fire. For me, it sits at number 4, largely due to its utility against regenerating units, and there is a lot of that nowadays. There's also a lot of physical resistance, and Flaming Sword of Ruin helps in that aspect as well. So moving on to number 3, we're going to go to Lore of Shadows. Yes, indeed. Lore of Shadows, one of the most beloved lores, very, very good in a multitude of situations. Let's talk about the spells. Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma is a nice direct damage magic. Does not that much damage, but it's pretty good against units with a lot of unit models. Think cavalry and up. But more importantly, it applies a -24% speed debuff, so you can use it to slow opponents down. Particularly, it's very useful against heavy cavalry because it slows them down, allows your other units to catch up and keep doing attacks, as well as doing some pretty decent damage to them. So definitely like Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma. Enfeebling Foe, everything we talked about harmonic convergence applies to Enfeebling Foe, but the reverse, because it's exactly the same effect, but instead it's a debuff rather than being a buff. So again, useful in a multitude of situations. If you're trying to take down a high value unit, you throw this on them, particularly like a lord or hero, and your units will be a lot more effective against them. You can stack this with things like Hunter of Champions on Wulfric, El Sif if you want to take a Shadow Vampiress with the vampires. You can really get characters into the dirt in terms of their stats. The Withering is another armor debuff, armor and leadership, which is only single target, but if you overcast, does add an area of effect. Very, very strong against certain factions. Against someone like the Dwarves, for example, you combine an Overcast Withering with a Famir Charge, you're getting that -60 armor in total, as well as the leadership debuff, meaning your non-armor piercing units are going to be much more effective. So, not one I always take, but certainly one that is useful, a nice one to have in the toolkit. Penumbral Pendulum is probably the best wind spell in the game right now, in my opinion. It's relatively cheap, not too expensive. 13 Winds of Magic is a bit, but it's not a crazy amount. You can get a couple of these in a game without too many problems. It does a ton of damage to unarmored units, and it has a pretty fast animation, so it's relatively hard to dodge, as compared to something like Wind of Death has a fast animation, but it has a long cast time. Burning Head, you know, the animation takes a bit longer to play out. Something like Fiery Convocation takes a lot longer to play out, so Penumbral Pendulum is one of those wind spells that I think is a really good balance between damage, cast time, and animation speed, and it just looks awesome to begin with. So a very cool spell and incredibly useful. One for me that's almost an auto pick now that it's aimable. Next, Occam's Mindrazor, magic damage and 40% weapon and AP. Pretty powerful buff. If you use this on someone that's fighting a physical resistance elite unit, like say you're fighting Grail Knights or Dragon Princes, this Occam's Mindrazor can help your units trade much more effectively there. So going to be very good in that aspect. Pit of Shades, the solitary vortex that is stationary. It stays in the same place, essentially acting as almost like a Dwellers Below, where it's like a big area of effect that just stays in the same place. It does pretty decent damage overall. If you overcast it, it does devastating damage, but overcasting it, at least I know it has the power to pin in cavalry models, like it'll stagger lock cavalry models sometimes, where it will actually do a lot of damage to them, so not only useful against big infantry blobs, but cavalry as well. And that kind of rounds out Lore of Shadows. The lore attribute for Lore of Shadows, of course, is Smoke and Mirrors, which gives a map-wide speed buff every time you cast a spell, which is, you know, always nice, especially with more mobility-focused builds. But yeah, Shadows, in particular, the Penumbral Pendulum and Enfeebling Foe are, for me, what's really set this lore apart and put it at my number 3. Moving on to number 2, the much-hated, much-maligned Lore of Death. Yes, indeed, Lore of Death has had many changes and has probably been the most broken, just completely broken Lore of Magic at times, but currently I actually think it's in a pretty decent place. Aspect of Dread Knight is a really nice spell that gives a bit of leadership and also allows the unit to cause terror, which can be very useful if you don't have a terror-causing unit in your army. It's a relatively cheap spell to bring, only 4 Winds of Magic. You can toss that terror out at a key engagement and get a nice terror route going. Coupling with that, we're going to skip Spirit Leech for now, is Doom and Darkness. Minus 16 leadership, single target, or if you overcast it, adds an area of effect. Overcast, Doom and Darkness in particular, can be very good at terror bombing certain factions. You stack a couple of leadership T-buffs, drop an Overcast, Doom and Darkness, you know, maybe a rear charge, some good shock damage, and a terror-causing unit. And somebody like Skaven or Greenskins, you can terrify away their units very, very quickly. So really like Doom and Darkness, especially coupling that with Aspect of Dread Knight. Spirit Leech, of course, not a lot needs to be said about Spirit Leech. You guys should be familiar with this spell. It's your reliable, single target, good against single entity models, you know, direct damage spell. Not really too much to say there. Useful. Exciting? No. But useful? Yes. Soul Blight here is a really nice debuff. Large area of effect, minus 30 armor, which again, you guys have seen before. That's a debuff effect that's very strong. Allows non-armor piercing units to be much better. It also gives minus 25% weapon damage, which is always nice, but in general, very useful to have, especially on someone like Marathi that has multiple lore attributes, where she can actually get the minus 15 from Spiteful Conjuration, the lore attribute from the Lore of Darkness, while also casting a Soul Blight, giving a total of minus 45 armor to that area of effect. So, a very strong spell, nice debuff, and definitely one to consider if you're facing armored units. Purple Sun, another very strong kind of elite tier vortex. This one is quite expensive, coming in at 18 regular and 24 overcast, but it does a devastating amount of damage. I mean, this thing is nasty, especially if you overcast it. Can even delete like elite cavalry and stuff. So this is, if I really want to go the damage route from Lore of Death, this is usually the main spell that I go for. Purple Sun, just super strong in certain situations, especially like a 2v2 or something, where there's going to be a lot of units on the table, but typical ups and downs of your vortexes, but one of the strongest of vortexes, I would say, certainly. And then we have the old Fate of Boring. I'm not really going to talk too much about this spell. because it's really, really boring. They nerfed it in the last patch, but I honestly don't see people taking it that much anymore. I don't really know how good it is because I haven't used it that much in this patch, because again, it's just so mind-numbingly, crushingly boring that I just refuse. So we're going to go ahead and leave it at that. That's Lore of Death. The lore attribute is Power of Darkness, which isn't exactly exciting. No, not Power of Darkness. Life Leeching, that's what it's called. Not exactly exciting. More reserve and recharge rate, which is always nice. Certainly it's powerful. Not really exciting, but it does give you more Winds of Magic with somebody like Manfred, who you currently see on screen here, can be particularly useful. So moving on here, and who would have thought the final Lore of Magic here is another one that's probably a bit hated, but overall just incredibly strong. Not enough can be said about the Lore of Life. Yes, indeed, your classical healing lore, and that's really what sets it apart, is that it's an access to healing for a lot of factions. I mean, obviously, like Lore of Nekara has a healing attribute, Lore of Vampires, but I'm kind of skipping over the faction-specific lores, and this is more so about the common lores of Magic, and certainly Lore of Life is the best. In most matchups, in most situations where you have access to Lore of Life, you're going to want to take it, because healing your units just generates so much value. Earthblood, of course, is your cheap, reliable healing spell. Good area of effect. Doesn't last a long time, but does a decent amount of regeneration. If you overcast it, just lasts longer, so it heals more, obviously. So, yeah, nice cheap heal. Awakening of the Wood is an explosion spell. Doesn't do that much damage, but does apply a 48% speed debuff, so if you think you're going to need it, it can be useful. I'm not the biggest fan, but I see some people using it quite often. Flesh to Stone is another one that, yeah, it's nice on paper, but when you have Lore of Life, you're going to want to be sinking most of your magic into Earthblood and Regrowth. So, Flesh to Stone, though, can be useful in certain situations. It's plus 60 armor on a single target for only 7 Winds of Magic. Not too bad at all. Shield of Thorns, of course, another one that, again, not wildly useful, but it's there. A 25% weapon damage, 22% missile resistance, so if you need to withstand some missile fire, you know, that's available to you as well. But again, Regrowth. Regrowth and Earthblood are going to be your go-tos with this Lore of Magic, and they're why this Lore of Magic is so strong. Regrowth heals a lot of HP. It's only single target, but it also gives some physical resistance, so this is kind of your elite protector. You know, you have some Demigryph Knights, you have some Grail Knights, some Dragon Princes. You put that Regrowth on them, it gives them the extra physical resistance and heals them up. So yeah, Regrowth, very, very powerful. And then finally, Dweller's Blow. Dweller's Blow is pretty decent right now, actually. I don't see people using it too often because it's not just absurdly broken like it was in the later patches of Total War Warhammer 1, but it does do a pretty solid amount of damage. Big stationary area of effect, also applies a 24% speed debuff, so, you know, it's pretty decent. I've seen it used occasionally to good effect, but not too often. But overall, of course, Lore of Life is focused around healing, and that's really why it's my #1 Lore of Magic. So, like I said, many of you are going to disagree with a lot of the points I've made here, which is fine. I totally accept that, and let me know in the comments down below, what are your top 5 common Lores of Magic? Do you rate the faction-specific magics over the common lores of Magic? Like, would you say that generally Lore of Nekara, like the Skaven lores, the Greenskin lores, are those better than the common lores? Or do you think that the common lores are really the cream of the crop? Let me know in the comments down below. Hope you guys enjoyed watching this one. I plan on making more top lists in the future. Hopefully, once I get some more editing skills, I can kind of put a little more pizzazz and spice to it, rather than just showing you a menu. But I figured, hey, with the Lores of Magic, at least we can look at the spells in the spell browser and kind of talk about things from there. So, thank you very much for watching. Hope you guys have enjoyed. If you do like this sort of content, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell notification button, so every time I upload a new video, you'll be notified. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.